Hello, this PowerPoint is for Chapter 16, Section 3, pages 392 to 396. We saw previously the different events that are happening in the United States that's creating more and more tension between the North and the South, and each of these events is drawing the country closer to the Civil War. So we'll continue on with what's been going on in the country. By the mid-1850s, slavery was primarily the big issue in the country that was really splitting people in the North and the South. And most political parties kind of didn't want to deal with that issue because they knew it was so divisive and it would be hard to get, enough followers one way or the other. So groups of people from the existing political parties at the time, the Free Soilers, the Democrats, the Whigs, people from each of those groups got together and created the Republican Party, and that's the Republican Party that still exists today. But it was begun in 1854, and its main goal was to keep slavery out of the Western territories. It was an anti-slavery platform. So in 1856, you have the presidential election coming up. The Republican Party has their first candidate. It's John C. Fremont, and he's opposed to the spread of slavery. The Democrats have James Buchanan, and there's another party at the time called the Know Nothings, and they chose Millard Fillmore, who had already served as president previously. So within that election, the Democrats won. James Buchanan became the president, but the Republican Party had a very good showing, and a lot of people turned out, and John C. Fremont came very close to actually winning that election. Some other tensions that are happening within Congress. There's Charles Sumner. He's a senator from Massachusetts. He's the man kind of lying down on the ground there. Prior to this event in the picture, he had made a speech on the floor of the Senate criticizing pro-slavery people and their behaviors, and he especially talked about one particular man. And what happened was, a few days later, this man's relative, Preston Brooks, who's the man holding the cane, he's a representative from Congress from South Carolina, and he stormed into the Senate and started attacking Charles Sumner with this cane. And there's a famous drawing of what happened. And he basically kept beating on Charles Sumner until he passed out, was very seriously injured. Brooks resigned after this. He wasn't arrested. He resigned, and then South Carolina held an election to replace his seat, and the people voted for him again. So he came back to the job that he had originally. Charles Sumner actually also returned to the Senate eventually too, after he recovered from his very serious injuries. But again, both sides, pro-slavery, anti-slavery, made both of these men heroes. And again, this event is just creating more tension between the two sides. Also during this time is when we first kind of see Abraham Lincoln coming to awareness about among people. And what happened was he ran for a seat in the Illinois Senate, and he was running against Stephen Douglas for the same seat. Abraham Lincoln wasn't very well known at the time. Stephen Douglas was very well known, but they were running against each other, and they held a series of debates, 7 different debates, and they show you the little map there of all the different rail stops that they stopped at, and they would hold these public debates. It wasn't like today where you have TV and radio and everything else. People had to come out and listen to the candidates debate each other and talk about their ideas. Most of these debates are about slavery, but also other things that were happening in the country as well. So these are known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Both men very gifted public speakers. Douglas supported the idea of popular sovereignty, whereas Lincoln was not in favor of slavery, but he promised he didn't want slavery to spread into the Western territories. He wasn't advocating, let's get rid of slavery altogether. He would just believe that slavery shouldn't be allowed to spread into any new states that are going to be created out of the Western territories. Newspapers would take these speeches and print them, so it became known to a much larger group of people than the ones that just showed up at the actual speeches. In the end, however, Douglas won the election by a very slim margin. So although Lincoln lost the election, he kind of had a win in the sense that he really came to people's attention, and people were very impressed with his speaking ability and his thoughts and ideas. And 2 years later, these two same men will come up against each other again, this time, though, in the presidential election. This is a quote from a very famous speech that Lincoln made during one of his debates. Along with being a gifted speaker, he's also very well known as a very gifted speech writer, and the speeches that he made are often quoted. And this is an excerpt from a famous speech often referred to as the House Divided speech. It says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all of one thing or all the other." And of course, he's talking about the slavery issue, and he's kind of prophesizing that he doesn't see how the country is going to continue on this pro-slavery, anti-slavery, that eventually it's going to come to a collision, these two sides. And he's kind of foreseeing that the Civil War and this division is eventually going to be happen. John Brown, we read about him in the previous section. He was involved in the Bleeding Kansas situation. If you remember, he and some of his followers went into a town in Kansas and killed several pro-slavery people. He was a fanatical anti-slavery person. He believed that God had put him on this earth to put an end to slavery, and he felt that that could only happen through violence and bloodshed. That was the only way that slavery was going to be stopped. This is a very famous painting. That's John Brown in the center there, kind of a larger-than-life character. This was done after the Bleeding Kansas issue, and if you can see, he's kind of stepping on the head of one of the pro-slavery people that he had fought against and killed. So as I said, very fanatical about the slavery issue. What he did, though, was he led a raid in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He and his group of abolitionists tried to take over an arsenal. An arsenal is a gun warehouse where all the arms and ammunition are kept. And his idea was he's going to steal all these guns and ammunition, and he's going to pass them out among the slaves, and the slaves will rebel against their owners and start this whole rebellion. That was his plan. However, it did not work out. The word just didn't get out, and the slaves didn't know they were supposed to come to the arsenal and get the weapons. And eventually, he and his followers were trapped inside the arsenal. The military sent out Robert E. Lee. He was a military leader at the time in Virginia, and he and his troops captured John Brown and his followers, and they were tried for murder and treason. And treason are actions against one's country. He and his men were found guilty, and they were all sentenced to death. They were hung. John Brown, people in the North made John Brown a hero. They didn't necessarily agree with his tactics as far as killing people and trying to lead a rebellion, but they admired him for his, anti-slavery beliefs. So some people in the North cheered him on as a hero. People in the South, of course, are outraged that why would anybody support a murderer and somebody who's trying to start up a rebellion. So Southerners, once again, are outraged and think that the North is just totally against them. And look at all these people who supported John Brown. They want to come into our homes and kill us. So it created even more tension that was already happening in the country.